Who were the table competent?
The court recognizes the name of the true owner.
The moment when a heart shatters is silent to the world but deafening to the one who bears it. Martha stood in the Virginia courthouse, her fingers trembling against the rough fabric of her dress, as the judge read aloud words that stripped away everything she had come to believe. The man she had called husband for 3 years, whom she had nursed through fever and shared quiet moments of tenderness with despite their different stations, was not who he claimed to be. Have you ever built your life around a truth only to discover it was fashioned from lies? That hollow feeling that spreads through your chest when you realize the person you trusted most has been deceiving you from the very beginning. The year was 1856 in Albemarle County, Virginia. The air outside the courthouse was thick with summer heat, carrying the scent of magnolias and the distant sounds of hammers striking against wood as new buildings rose in the expanding town. The courthouse itself was a testament to Southern prosperity, with its imposing columns and polished wooden benches that now held dozens of onlookers, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment as they watched the drama unfold before them. This was not merely a legal proceeding but a spectacle, the kind that would be recounted over dinner tables and in hushed conversations for weeks to come. Martha Wilson was the daughter of a modestly successful merchant who had died leaving her with enough inheritance to live comfortably, but not extravagantly. At 26, she was considered beyond the prime age for marriage, her prospects diminishing with each passing season. She was neither remarkably beautiful nor plain, with chestnut hair often pulled back in a simple style, and eyes that reflected a quiet intelligence. What she possessed beyond her modest means was a compassionate nature that sometimes bordered on naivety, a quality that had endeared her to some but left her vulnerable to others. She had resigned herself to a life of spinsterhood until she met Samuel. Samuel Johnson appeared in Albemarle County in the spring of 1853, a man of striking appearance and gentle manners, who claimed to be a free black man from Pennsylvania. He spoke with an education that surprised many, explained by his account of having been raised by Quakers who ensured he received schooling. His skin was light enough that in some northern cities he might have passed for Mediterranean or exotic, but in Virginia, the lines of racial distinction were drawn with unforgiving precision. Despite this, he had established himself as a skilled carpenter, whose craftsmanship was sought after by families wishing to add distinctive touches to their homes. His hands could transform wood into objects of beauty, creating elaborate moldings and furniture pieces that commanded respect, even from those who would not invite him to their tables. The first time Martha saw Samuel was at her cousin's home, where he had been commissioned to build a set of cabinets. She had been struck not by his appearance but by the gentle way he explained his work to her cousin's curious children, patiently answering their questions and showing them how different woods had different qualities. When he spoke to Martha, he addressed her with a respect that was neither presumptuous nor subservient. Their conversation about the properties of cherry wood compared to oak was brief, but it left an impression that lingered long after he departed. In the weeks that followed, their paths crossed with increasing frequency, seemingly by chance, though later Martha would question every coincidence. The turning point came during a violent thunderstorm that swept through the county, leaving destruction in its wake. Martha had been returning from visiting a friend when the skies opened. Samuel, working on a nearby property, offered her shelter in the workshop where he was employed. For 3 hours they remained trapped by the deluge, their conversation moving from polite pleasantries to deeper discussions of literature and philosophy. Samuel revealed a depth of knowledge that fascinated Martha, who had always hungered for intellectual companionship. By the time the storm passed, something fundamental had shifted between them. What began as furtive meetings evolved into a clandestine courtship. Samuel told Martha that while legally a free man with papers to prove it, the prevailing attitudes of Virginia society would never allow them to openly court. His caution seemed born of wisdom rather than deception, and Martha, moved by what she perceived as injustice, agreed to keep their relationship secret. When Samuel eventually proposed marriage, he suggested a small ceremony in a neighboring county, where a minister sympathetic to their situation would perform the rites without questions. Martha, already in love and swayed by romantic notions of defying societal constraints, agreed despite the warnings of her one confidant, her elderly maid Bessie, who viewed Samuel with undisguised suspicion. The wedding took place on a crisp autumn morning with only 2 witnesses present, the minister and his wife. Martha wore a simple blue dress rather than traditional white, a concession to the unusual nature of their union. Samuel had prepared a small cottage on the outskirts of the county, modest but comfortable, where they began their married life. For 3 years, they lived in relative isolation, but apparent contentment. Samuel continued his carpentry work, often traveling for commissions, while Martha tended their home and gradually won the cautious acceptance of their nearest neighbors, an elderly couple who valued her medical knowledge when ailments troubled them. The facade began to crack in small ways Martha might have recognized had love not clouded her perception. Samuel was occasionally absent for days longer than his work required. He received letters that he read privately and immediately destroyed. When asked about his family in Pennsylvania, his accounts contained subtle inconsistencies. Most tellingly, he displayed an inexplicable anxiety whenever militia or law enforcement passed near their home. Martha attributed these peculiarities to the natural caution of a black man in the South, never suspecting a far more complicated truth was hiding beneath the surface. The deception might have continued indefinitely had fate not intervened in the form of Jonathan Blackwell, a plantation owner from South Carolina, who arrived in Albemarle County tracking a fugitive slave. Blackwell caught a glimpse of Samuel in town, and recognition flashed across his face like lightning across a darkened sky. Without confronting Samuel directly, Blackwell made inquiries that led him to discover the supposed free man had constructed an entirely fictional identity. The man calling himself Samuel Johnson was actually Isaiah, a valuable slave who had escaped from Blackwell's plantation 4 years earlier, taking with him not only his own person, but supposedly forged freedom papers that had allowed him to establish his new identity. The weeks that followed were a carefully orchestrated campaign of investigation and preparation. Blackwell, a methodical man who prided himself on his business acumen, gathered witnesses and documentation to prove his claim. When everything was in place, he obtained a warrant for Isaiah's arrest as both a fugitive slave and a thief. The sheriff and 2 deputies arrived at the cottage Martha and Samuel shared early one morning while Samuel was preparing to leave for a commission. The confusion on his face when they called him Isaiah was genuine, but it quickly gave way to resigned recognition. The identity he had built so carefully was collapsing like a house of cards in a strong wind. Martha, witnessing the arrest from the doorway, initially believed it to be a terrible mistake. She followed the men to town, protesting that her husband was a free man, with documentation to prove it. It was only when they reached the courthouse and the proceedings began that the full extent of the deception began to unfold before her. Blackwell presented witnesses who identified Samuel as Isaiah, including a former overseer who pointed to a distinctive scar on his shoulder resulting from a whipping years earlier. Most damning were the records Blackwell produced, showing the purchase of Isaiah 15 years earlier, including a physical description that matched Samuel in every particular. When the judge addressed him as Isaiah and asked if he denied being the property of Jonathan Blackwell, Samuel's eyes sought Martha's across the crowded courtroom. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken words and collapsing dreams. Finally, Samuel spoke, his voice barely audible in the suddenly silent room. "I am Isaiah." His admission was followed by an explanation that he had fled after overhearing plans to sell him away from his wife and children, who remained on Blackwell's plantation. His apparent bachelor status in Virginia had been yet another fiction in a life constructed of careful lies. For Martha, each revelation was a physical blow. The man she had married was not only a fugitive slave rather than a free man, but also already married with children he had never mentioned. Every conversation, every intimate moment they had shared over 3 years was cast in a new and terrible light. The court proceedings continued around her, but Martha heard little beyond the roaring in her ears as her world disintegrated. The judge's final declaration that Isaiah was indeed the legal property of Jonathan Blackwell and would be returned to South Carolina under guard barely penetrated her consciousness. What happened next would be recounted in Albemarle County for generations, though the tellings would vary depending on the sympathies of the narrator. Martha, who had remained silent and still throughout most of the proceedings, suddenly rose to her feet. In a voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom, she declared that if Samuel or Isaiah was to be returned to slavery, she would accompany him as his wife. A murmur rippled through the spectators at this unprecedented statement. Interracial marriage was not merely socially unacceptable but illegal in Virginia, a fact the judge reminded Martha of with cold precision. It was then that Blackwell, who had observed Martha throughout the proceedings with calculating eyes, saw an opportunity. Addressing the court, he suggested that since the purported marriage was invalid under Virginia law, Martha had no legal relationship to his property. However, if she wished to relocate to his plantation, he would not object to her presence provided she made herself useful as a tutor to his children. The offer was presented as generosity, but understood by all present as something more insidious, a wealthy man adding another possession to his collection, one who had demonstrated value through her devotion. The judge, eager to conclude the scandalous proceedings, declared the case settled. Isaiah would be returned to his rightful owner, and if Martha Wilson chose to follow, That was a private arrangement outside the court's purview. As Isaiah was led away in chains, Martha stood alone, her face a mask of determination hiding the turmoil beneath. The question that hung in the air, unspoken but present in every gaze that followed her from the courthouse, was whether she would actually follow through on her declaration. For 3 days, Martha secluded herself in the cottage that no longer felt like home. On the morning Blackwell was scheduled to depart for South Carolina with his reclaimed property, she appeared at the hotel where he was staying, a single trunk containing her possessions beside her. Her decision had been made not out of naive romance but a complex mixture of love, guilt, and stubborn defiance of a system she had come to despise. If she could not save Isaiah, she would at least bear witness to his fate and perhaps in some small way provide comfort. The journey to South Carolina was a descent into a reality Martha had understood only in abstract terms before. Isaiah, chained and watched constantly for signs of escape attempts, was not permitted to speak with her. Blackwell treated her with superficial courtesy that did nothing to disguise the underlying contempt in his eyes. Each mile that carried them deeper into the South seemed to strip away another layer of the life Martha had known, replacing it with harsh new truths about the world and her place in it. Blackwell's plantation, Willow Creek, sprawled across fertile land with fields of cotton stretching to the horizon. The main house stood as a monument to wealth built on human suffering, its grand facade concealing the ugliness of its foundation. It was here that Martha encountered the final revelation in a series of painful truths. Isaiah's wife, Dinah, was not a distant memory, but very much present, a strong woman whose eyes held a lifetime of hardship and endurance. Their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl ranging from 7 to 12 years old, regarded Martha with understandable confusion and suspicion. The reality of her position crystallized in that moment. In the narrative Isaiah had constructed in Virginia, Martha had been a wife. Here in South Carolina, she was an interloper, a complication, a reminder of a brief taste of freedom that had ended in failure. Blackwell, true to his word, installed her as a tutor to his 4 children, a position that placed her in an ambiguous social space, neither family nor servant, neither fully accepted nor entirely rejected. She lived in a small room in the main house, taking meals alone and existing in a state of isolation despite being surrounded by people. Isaiah was returned to his former role as a skilled carpenter, valuable property to be utilized but closely watched. Martha caught glimpses of him working around the property, but direct interaction was forbidden by Blackwell's explicit orders. She learned from hushed conversations with house slaves that Isaiah had been publicly whipped upon his return, not severely enough to permanently damage valuable property, but sufficiently to serve as a warning against future escape attempts. The knowledge that her presence might be the only thing preventing worse punishment became both comfort and burden. 6 months into this strange existence, an unexpected development altered the precarious balance. Blackwell's wife, Caroline, who had initially regarded Martha with thinly veiled hostility, fell seriously ill with a fever that left local physicians baffled. Drawing on knowledge gained from her father's medical books and Bessie's folk remedies, Martha took it upon herself to nurse Caroline. For 2 weeks, she barely left the sick room, applying cool compresses, preparing herbal infusions, and monitoring symptoms with a dedication that surprised even Blackwell. When Caroline finally recovered, the household dynamics shifted subtly. Martha was no longer merely tolerated but accorded a measure of genuine respect. This new status provided Martha with limited influence, which she carefully deployed to improve conditions for those enslaved on the plantation. Small changes at first: better food, reduced workloads for pregnant women, permission for families to live together rather than in segregated quarters. Each concession was framed as beneficial to Blackwell's interests, appealing to efficiency rather than humanity, since she quickly learned which arguments would succeed. Throughout these efforts, she maintained a careful distance from Isaiah, their shared past buried beneath the reality of their present circumstances. The twist that no one could have anticipated came in the form of a legal document discovered among Caroline's father's papers after his death. The elderly judge had maintained meticulous records of his legal affairs, including the manumission of a slave named Isaiah, purchased from Blackwell years earlier specifically to be freed as repayment of a debt of honor. The document, properly witnessed and filed, had never been delivered due to the judge's failing health and subsequent death. By law, Isaiah had actually been a free man for over 5 years, his recapture and return to slavery entirely unlawful. When Caroline brought this document to her husband, expecting him to correct the error, she discovered a side of Blackwell she had never fully acknowledged. He refused to recognize the manumission, claiming it must be a forgery or mistake. The confrontation between husband and wife escalated until Blackwell struck Caroline, an act witnessed by Martha from the doorway. In that moment, the facades fell away, revealing the true character of the man who ruled Willow Creek with absolute authority. The events that followed unfolded with the inevitability of Greek tragedy. Caroline, her illusions about her husband shattered, secretly provided Martha with funds and arranged for a trusted family lawyer to bring Isaiah's case before a different judge in Charleston. Martha, knowing discovery would mean disaster, worked through intermediaries to prepare a legal challenge while maintaining her role as tutor and Caroline's companion. Meanwhile, rumors of the manumission document spread among the enslaved population, creating a dangerous undercurrent of hope and resentment that Blackwell sensed but could not identify the source of. The court case in Charleston became a sensation, attracting attention throughout South Carolina. The judge, an old colleague of Caroline's father, agreed to hear the case despite Blackwell's attempts to have it dismissed. When Martha appeared as a witness, revealing herself as the white woman who had knowingly married a man she believed to be free, the courtroom erupted in scandalized whispers. Her testimony, delivered with quiet dignity despite the hostility directed toward her, detailed both Isaiah's misrepresentation of his status and Blackwell's unlawful actions in reclaiming a legally free man. The pivotal moment came when the judge called for the original manumission document to be presented. Caroline herself brought it forward, publicly defying her husband for the first time in their marriage. As the judge read aloud the name of Isaiah's true owner, the man who had purchased and immediately freed him, it was revealed to be none other than Judge William Harrison, Caroline's father. The document explicitly stated that Isaiah was to be granted not only freedom, but a sum of money sufficient to establish himself independently, a final act of conscience from a man who had spent decades enforcing laws he had come to question. For Isaiah, standing in the courtroom with his fate once again in the hands of white authority, the revelation brought not joy, but a complex mixture of emotions visible in the tension of his body and the careful neutrality of his expression. Freedom legally granted could still be freedom practically denied in a society built on racial hierarchies. For Martha, the vindication was similarly complicated by the knowledge that while law might declare Isaiah free, it could never restore what had been lost between them: trust, uncomplicated love, the simple belief in another person's truth. The judge's ruling was unequivocal. Isaiah was legally free and had been at the time of his capture. Blackwell was ordered to pay significant damages for wrongful imprisonment, though no criminal charges were pursued, a concession to his social standing. The courtroom received the judgment with reactions that divided cleanly along racial and class lines: jubilation from black observers and abolitionists, grim acceptance or outrage from those who saw it as an assault on the institution that underpinned their way of life. In the aftermath, Isaiah faced the complicated reality of legal freedom in the antebellum South. Despite having won his case, remaining in South Carolina would mean constant danger of re-enslavement through legal chicanery or simple kidnapping. His family, still legally owned by Blackwell, complicated any decision to leave. Martha, whose public testimony had made her a pariah among white society, found herself in an equally precarious position. Caroline, having taken an irrevocable stand against her husband, returned to Willow Creek only long enough to collect her personal possessions before seeking refuge with relatives in North Carolina. The resolution came not through further legal battles, but through the unexpected appearance of abolitionists who had followed the case. Representatives of the Underground Railroad approached Martha with a dangerous proposition: a plan to help Isaiah's family escape north, beyond the reach of slave catchers and fugitive slave laws. The risk was enormous, the consequences of failure catastrophic, but the alternative was permanent separation or continued enslavement. After agonizing deliberation, both Martha and Isaiah agreed to the plan, though for different reasons, she driven by guilt and a desire to make amends, he by the fundamental need to secure his family's freedom. What followed was a harrowing journey northward, traveling by night, hiding in safe houses by day, constantly alert for the sounds of pursuit. Martha's presence in the group created additional complications, her white face drawing attention in some contexts while providing useful cover in others. Isaiah and Martha barely spoke during the journey, the weight of their shared past and uncertain future creating a distance that seemed unbridgeable. Dinah watched this silent negotiation with eyes that missed nothing, her own feelings kept carefully guarded for the sake of her children, who already bore the confusion and fear of their sudden flight. When they finally crossed into Canada after weeks of travel, the legal reality of freedom became tangible. In a small settlement of similarly escaped slaves, Isaiah's family began to build a new life from nothing, facing poverty and prejudice, but no longer property. Martha, having fulfilled her commitment to see them safely to freedom, prepared to depart. It was then that Isaiah finally spoke to her directly, not with romantic declarations or easy forgiveness, but with difficult honesty. They sat across from each other in the small room Martha had been given, the single candle between them casting long shadows on rough wooden walls. "The truth I never told you," Isaiah said, watching her face carefully, "was that I did love you. Not at first when I saw you only as a means of strengthening my disguise, but later, when I knew you. That love was real, but it was built on a foundation that could not last. I had a wife, children, a life I abandoned but never forgot. I wronged all of you by trying to claim 2 lives, 2 families, 2 selves." His words offered no excuse, only explanation, a recognition of harm done without expectation of absolution. Martha, who had imagined this conversation countless times during their journey north, found that her carefully prepared responses evaporated in the face of his honesty. What emerged instead was a simple truth of her own. "I came with you not because I still believed in what we were, but because I needed to believe in something larger than ourselves. This country's sickness made you lie and made me blind. Perhaps the only redemption for either of us is to acknowledge that truth and move forward carrying it." She did not suggest reconciliation or continued connection, recognizing that some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt, but only acknowledged as markers of where different paths diverged. The following morning, Martha departed for Boston, carrying little more than she had arrived with, but fundamentally changed by the experience. Isaiah remained with his family in Canada, slowly rebuilding connections strained by years of separation and the shadow of Martha's presence. Neither knew if their paths would cross again, but both carried the lessons of their shared history, the dangers of deception, the complexity of love across social boundaries, and the profound moral cost of a system that turned human beings into property. Years later, when the Civil War tore apart the nation whose contradictions had shaped their lives, Martha worked as a nurse for the Union Army, tending wounded soldiers with the skills honed caring for Caroline Blackwell. Isaiah, having established himself as a carpenter in Toronto, contributed to abolitionist causes and educated his children with a fierce emphasis on both knowledge and honesty. Though separated by distance and experience, they had both been transformed by their encounter with each other in the system they had challenged, carrying those changes forward into lives that sought, in different ways, to address the fundamental injustice they had personally witnessed. The true owner whose name the judge read in that Charleston courtroom was not merely the man who had purchased Isaiah's freedom, but the embodiment of conscience awakening in a society built on injustice. For Martha and Isaiah, for Dinah and her children, for Caroline and countless others whose lives intersected with the institution of slavery, the question of true ownership extended beyond legal documents to the fundamental human right to self-determination. Their story, like many from this dark period of American history, reminds us that freedom is not merely a legal status, but a lived reality, one that continues to be negotiated in societies still carrying the legacy of historical wrongs. If this story of impossible choices and the search for justice despite personal cost resonates with something in your own experience, I invite you to join our community of viewers seeking to understand history's complexities. By subscribing to this channel, you'll gain access to more meticulously researched narratives that explore the hidden corners of our past with sensitivity and depth. These are not simply stories of suffering, but testimonies to human resilience and the ongoing struggle for dignity. Click subscribe to continue this journey of historical discovery that is also a journey toward healing the wounds that still echo in our society today.